a new session, Personalized Learning, How Privacy is at Stake When Big Data Meets Education. I'm very honored to chair this session. So the session is about, you could say, the digitization of learning and institutions in public education, and what it does to pupils, what it does to teachers, and what kind of impact does it have. I would say, connecting it to an interesting publication really called The Platform Society by Van Dijk, Poole and De Waal. They talk about datafication, commodification and selection. I would say this is an excellent example of how even in a public area like education, for European person and Belgian person, education is mainly or only fully public, and of course not the case in other countries, how there datafication and commodification take place, often in a hidden way, you could say, and this will be the kind of the topics being discussed today. And what does it do to these kinds of institutions? What does it do to education? What does it do to the people involved there? In that sense, you could say it's also very much related to what we heard the first day, the launch of the book by Shoshana Zuboff, talking about surveillance capitalism and creeping into all kinds of sectors, among them also being the educational sector. Personally, I have an experience in that sense about EdTech and how being used in primary school. My son just left primary school, but in the last 2 years he had also a kind of an EdTech where they followed him and they did diversification of students. It was called, the application was called Snapit, and when starting to use it, I looked closely at it, and luckily, from my perspective, it was a kind of based on a foundation in the Netherlands that developed it, and so their goal was not generating money for the shareholders next quarter, but was doing better education. So I was reassured by that at that moment. How we're gonna organize this? So we have a total of 4 speakers and 3 presentations. In that sense, each speaker will speak around 12 minutes. And the end, hopefully, have still something like half an hour for debate and audience questions. Let me briefly introduce now the different speakers, starting with the moderator today. That's Lina Jasmontaite. Very well correct. Okay, sorry if I didn't pronounce it well. A PhD program at the Free University of Brussels and participating in a European project called Constructing on Alliance for Value-Driven Cybersecurity. Her main research expertise is within human rights, regulation of new technologies and cybersecurity. Then the first speaker will be Jen Persson, Director of Defenddigitalme in the UK. She's a heavy campaigner for safe, fair and transparent use of data across the education sector in England and beyond. Her main interest is in data privacy, data protection law, and increasingly also emerging technologies, including applications of AI and personalized learning. And she has been writing a lot about government plans to use health data and data from other areas like education. Then, third person I want to introduce is Valerie Steeves. She is Associate Professor at the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Her main area of research is human rights and technology issues, and her main expertise is related to issues about policy surveillance, health surveillance, surveillance of children, and surveillance in schools. Then we have Priscilla Regan. She's professor at Shah School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in the US, although in the program you are mentioned as Georgetown, which is not true, I assume then.
George Mason.
George Mason, yeah.
There's 3 Georges in DC. So.
Okay, yeah. And the correct one is George Mason. She has a focus on analysis of social policy and legal implications of organizational use of new information and communication technologies, and also on the emergence of and implementation of electronic government initiatives by federal agencies. And interestingly enough, in her CV, it also mentioned she was involved in the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment in the past, which I highly am interested in, because I think technology assessment is still very relevant and timely today, talking about the data protection impact assessments and so on. Then, last but not least, we have Stacey Gray. She is a policy counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum in the US, working on issues of data collection in online and mobile platforms, EdTech and Internet of Things, and a big expertise in cross-device tracking, smart home technologies, and federal regulation and enforcement actions on that level. She's interested in the ways which technology can be harnessed to advance civic knowledge and civil rights while safeguarding consumer privacy. Just to mention me, I come from the Free University of Brussels. I'm associate professor there in the media department and also principal investigator in a research institute which is called IMEC in Flanders, Belgium. I'm currently holding a chair on data protection on the ground. My main interest is also in platforms, algorithms, and data privacy. So with this introduction, I would now like to give the floor to our moderator of today, Lina. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. There is not much to say, apart that technology has become integrated into schools and now is the link between schools and home. And I will, without further ado, give a floor to Jen, who is going to talk more about it. And in particular, she will focus on an administrative perspective of school administration and the way they are handling pupils' data. So, Jen.
Thank you, Lina. Good afternoon, everyone. In England in 2017, our Children's Commissioner launched a report called Growing Up Digital. And she said, we are failing in our fundamental responsibility as adults to give children the tools they need to be agents of their own lives. And I firmly believe nowhere is that more apparent from the very beginning of their lives than in education. We're going to start by focusing somewhat on our own areas of expertise geographically. But increasingly, all of these issues are global. We also need to bear in mind the context of where these issues stem from when they are state or when they are corporate designed, that they each come within their own context. So I am very aware of my limitations when I talk about a child's experience in England is very different from the experience of a child in Kenya going to school who is paying for that, using a tablet provided by an international corporate, perhaps through a third party or a trust or an endowment fund. There are very different models of education around the world. But I'm going to start by giving you a flavour of what it's like in England today to be a child. Because as a parent, I have been absolutely shocked to see how different education is from my own experience. And I think the reasons behind that is something that Priscilla and Val will explore in a lot more detail. At 8 o'clock at home, Kate receives an email from school saying, don't forget to bring in your project today. At 8:30, she's crossing the school crossing to go into her grounds and is recorded on the body cam of the school patrol crossing officer. Crossing the playground, she's recorded on CCTV. By 9 o'clock, she's in her classroom. She's registered by her teacher, logged into the school-wide platform. Overnight, it was connected to the cloud-based school's information management system provider, who has a record of every single child by name and all their behaviors, activities, attainment, and behaviors throughout the day, every day of their school lives. At 9:15, she clicks away the little tiny notice on her screen that says, your web monitoring, every keystroke will be monitored. Because we have now in England web monitoring and surveillance of every child's every online activity, used as a tool for safeguarding in schools. By 11 o'clock, she's already logged into 3 different apps, 2 of which are using her own personal mobile phone. She's using them as a filler, perhaps at the end of a maths class. Do a little quiz to check your instruction and understanding of what the teacher has told you. At 1 o'clock, she's using her finger in the queue for lunch, because most schools in England are now using biometrics to give access to a cashless payment system. Press it again. Press harder. No, not that finger. Try again. The kinds of comments I get from my daughter, who laughs because she's the only child out of 2,000 in her school that has requested the option of using a card rather than her fingerprint. By 3 o'clock and leaving school, she's already logged into 3 different platforms. By the end of the day, these platforms has exchanged information with third-party providers, with apps, with cloud-based systems, and also local LAN-based systems. Post-school clubs, they have interacted with the school's information management system to say what her hobbies are and how she's getting on in football club. Going home, she logs into her Google Classroom to get what homework she's got for the evening, and forgetting to log out of her school-assigned account, bearing in mind she's only 11, she's already being tracked on YouTube from what she's watching in the evening at home in her personal time. Some of those safeguarding in schools monitoring systems also monitor whenever you're logged into the school network or whenever you're using a school-provided device. So if she'd been given a classroom Chromebook, all that activity would be monitored constantly and sent back to school records if she triggered a keyword that was of concern for her own well-being or for experiencing signs of radicalization. That's just one day. Every day of that child's life. By the time she's 11, she was signed up to 11 apps, all without my knowledge. By the time she's 18, her entire school record, behaviors, activity, attainment, special educational needs, health, will all have been sent to the government on an individual pupil-named basis over 50 times in school census collections. And that data is then sent to national pupil databases and distributed to third parties, most of whom who are processing that data, given it for free, are then reselling it back into the school system as a secondary use for measuring benchmarking, attainment, and comparing the market of our education so that parents like me have a better choice of which school I want to send my child to. What choice is real? What choice has been created, and for whom, are the kinds of questions we need to be asking about education today. The meaning of learning, the role of learners and teachers, is something that colleagues will speak more about. But the administration of the school system has become overwhelmingly dominated by technology, especially in England, in times of austerity. Anything that is seen to cut workload for teachers is beneficial, is seen as positive. So this is even before we get to the datafied child that Lupton and Williams called them in their research work for 2017. And why does this matter? Why does it matter as CPDP attendees, and what do I hope you'll take away? Who shapes and controls a children's lifetime education is not constrained to the school anymore. It is going out to third parties. It's being used in apps for developing even employment screening tools. And one has to question who and why makes those decisions of why that is a fair use of children's data. Now, at national level, our government will say there are strict guidelines, controls, and practices at the top of deciding who gets that information. But there's certainly no decision made by the parent or the child, because none of this data is optional, and there is no opt-out of its secondary reuse. So what have we been doing about this? Well, we have been mapping the landscape in education in England because it's impossible to try and solve problems that you can't see. And parents aren't aware how much data is collected. So last year, we carried out a survey through Survation and asked 1,000 parents of children aged 5 to 18 in the English education, state education system, because the children's experience in private, paid-for education may be very different. We asked them questions around what they understood about this use of technology, how much data is collected, who uses it. 69% of them said they didn't know a national pupil database existed. Of those who replied that their children was using biometrics in school, bear in mind this could be fingerprint, handprint, eye recognition on the screen, 38% of them said they'd not been offered any choice. And that's despite having a law in England specifically around biometrics, and that one parent or a child, if they object, must not be used. So we used some of that information from our survey to write this report, The State of Data. And if anyone is interested in a copy afterwards, I'm happy to send you one after the event. We also have some of the statistics and a small section of it on our stand in the exhibition hall. But it basically showed that 50% of parents feel they do not have control of their child's digital footprint in school. Schools rely on the legal basis for processing under GDPR of Article 6. Processing necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest or an exercise of their authority. How many of those third parties that we mentioned earlier would fall under that lawful basis of processing? We believe very few, if any. So there's no fair processing. There's a very flawed consent model that manufactures a tick box or a signature between schools and parents in homeschool agreements, often around things like, we won't bring the school into disrepute on social media, and I understand that my web use will be monitored, but what that means and by whom is not made clear. And there's missing consent where it is required in the biometrics example. So these platforms, these apps, these biometrics, safeguarding, interventions with children are no longer data captured, for example, for research purposes, but are being used to nudge the behavior of a child in school, to record the behavior of that child in school. And most concerningly, I think, some of these apps are used to shame the behavior of children in school in front of their peers. So some of these apps will be able to be controlled by the teacher, and with the best of intentions. Let me be very clear, there's no intention to be malicious, but there's very little research around the effects this has on the child's interpretation of their experience. They will get a small pop-up face, smiley, frowny. If they've misbehaved, they get a behavior point recorded against them. And some schools gather these points through the system throughout the year, and only those children who have reached enough positive behavior points are those that get to go on the school trip at the end of the year. Now, we constantly talk in England about behavioral issues, but is this the way to treat them? So we've got questions around governance. We've got questions around the direction of travel in regulation and enforcement. And we've certainly got questions around where there are gaps in the regulations as how to meet GDPR, and the hopes that we have is that some of these issues will become the issues that actually are seen as important. To take away and say, why does it matter that we should care about what happens to children's data rights? We hear very little about it. In the GDPR, Professor Sonia Livingston, Eva Levens and her colleagues, Joseph Samaruthu, Sandra Leeton-Gray, others in England all raised the point that there's very little evidence of research used in the GDPR informing what was appropriate for children, especially around age verification, biometrics, use of sensitive data, and in particular because children do not have a power of consent, even where we say it is, because it simply doesn't, it's not meaningful. So my hope is that, and this is in the context of the irony of being in Brussels today, as a British European, my hope is that the Working Party 29 will update the guidelines, 2009 guidelines for education, and that we can see very specific guidelines and codes of practice set in place for children to protect children's rights, and that we look towards some of these bigger issues, why and how the appropriation of funding in education and the appropriation of language in education has really shifted what education means today and what it means to be a child in the school system. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation, Jen. And indeed, it's a very stark difference in this initial perception of a technology that it should provide like innovative and new ways for children to learn and educate themselves, and this actual reality where children are being monitored all the time because we assume that children, as well as adults, if left unmonitored, they would end up doing nothing good or nothing much. And there are a lot of interesting points that you refer to, including, of course, the legal ground for such processing. But now I will turn to the Priscilla and Valerie, who are going to present their paper, which is work in progress. And without further ado, I will give the floor to them.
Lina, we don't have it up on the screen, so.
Oh.
Okay, there it is. All right. Okay, and I'll be able to click through. Yes, okay. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm presenting some work that Val and I have done and are continuing to do as part of a grant that we have through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Val is a principal investigator on that grant, and I'm a co-investigator on that grant. And the overall grant is on equality, youth, big data, and discrimination. And one of the research threads that we are exploring has to do with education, specifically ed tech, and sort of how algorithms are being used in personalized learning software to direct the kind of learning opportunities that students are given. And as we've been doing that research and investigate kind of ed tech and privacy, we've really identified the importance and the literature on the role of philanthropy in education. And that role of philanthropy in education has been around for a while, but there's a clear interest now in what are sometimes called venture philanthropists or corporate philanthropists in education. And it's a change from the kind of interest that philanthropists had, kind of Andrew Carnegie type philanthropists in education. We've specifically focused in this research on the tech company philanthropists. These players have been fairly active for a while, since about the late 90s, 2000, in the education area. And we see this as kind of a new phase in terms of philanthropy in education that has, we think, three important consequences. One is it puts young people, students, in an environment which sort of desensitizes them to surveillance, the kinds of things that Jen was just describing, where this is sort of part of their lives. Second, there's a concern that the effect of this is going to further weaken the notion of the public in public education and the role of education in terms of preparing citizens and preparing people to be part of a larger social community, and not just to be consumers. And then finally, this is another instance of kind of the hollowing out of the role of government, that these players, because of the revenue that they bring and the constraints that educational organizations throughout the world are, constrained in terms of state resources for education, that this is a new revenue stream that appears very attractive to countries. Let me just say, these are the tech company foundations are mainly sort of U.S. tech company foundations, but with a global reach. So they are very active in Europe, in South America, in Africa, any place where there is a potential market. So the goals of our paper and research are to shed some light on the privacy issues that are raised here. And second, to identify the ways in which personalized learning is being presented to educators. This is one of our key concerns, is what are educators hearing about personalized learning? What's the discourse, the narrative around personalized learning? And then to analyze the implications of this for education generally, but privacy in specifics. So if we look at philanthropy in education, we see that the sort of policy space around especially K through 12 education is really complex in nature, congested in terms of the number of participants in that space, and contested in terms of the goals and priorities. So, and this is true, you know, in all countries. That, you know, education policy is a contested space. The research indicates that foundation giving to education has undergone a fundamental shift, as I mentioned earlier, and the new kind of wealthy philanthropists are not just sort of following that traditional charity model, but are creating trusts with endowments or are creating limited liability corporations. And in either case, no matter which way they're going, they're shielding money from taxes. And in the case of the tech company philanthropists, they're acting in a space in which they are able to promote their products and their services. And we've already seen that in those areas. Now, when we look at this generally, and this is sort of more background, some people are very critical of this corporate foundation funding. Some people are very positive about it, that this is kind of manna from heaven, that there's lots of benefits that'll accrue to everybody. And some are more skeptical. This is in the literature and the research that's been done. And that, you know, there can be good from corporate philanthropy, but they really need to be more transparent and more accountable. Specifically with respect to the tech company foundations, there's 5 ways in which they're active in the sort of K-12 space. The first is giving grants to schools or to, you know, directly to educational institutions. Second is giving grants to ed tech companies, so funding the companies that are selling the products in the schools or placing the products in the schools. Third is supporting coverage for ed tech in the media, in educational publications, but in other publications as well. Fourth, funding research into studies evaluating the results of ed tech applications, and then funding the advocacy groups that are active in this space. So it's a complex, you know, sort of set of activities that they're involved in, but touching kind of every element of, you know, sort of the policy framework for K through 12 education. So the methodology that we use today and the data that we're presenting today, we've got 2 data sets that we drew upon to analyze the themes, the discourses, the narratives that are being developed. The first is the websites of 5 tech company foundations. The first 3, the Gates, the Dell, and the Hewlett Foundation, were identified in earlier research as being among the top 5 funders of philanthropy and education. So there are obvious choices that we would look at those 3, and that's going back 2000, 2005, 2010. We're also looking at Google and at Chan Zuckerberg, who are big players in this space. Didn't fall into that earlier study because Google is, they both have different legal status, so they're not for nonprofits. And then the second data set are articles that we identified in Education Week, which is a weekly publication, a commercial publication that is directed at educators in the US, in North America generally, and we pull the articles from those from 5 years that discuss personalized learning and discussed foundations. And the foundations, all 5 of those activities are covered in the articles in EdWeek. So now to the findings. Okay, from the foundation, I'll do the foundation websites. Val will do the Ed Weekly articles in the conclusion. So as we go through the websites, we see certain themes that are developed. First one is education is in crisis. So this first quote that you see here is from the Chan Zuckerberg website, you know, that education established over a century ago, lots of problems here. The Hewlett Foundation is the second one. You know, sort of we could be wasting human potential. We need to tackle the most pressing issues. In terms of personalized learning, how they talk about it and how they define it, and this is one of the problems, it's really not defined, is that for the first quote, Hewlett talks about it as a flexible learning, providing flexible learning opportunities. Chan Zuckerberg, the second quote, a truly transformative personalized learning experience. Dell, the right experiences to help them learn. In the discussion, is this really interesting sort of discussion about the way they frame data. Personalized learning is implicitly driven by data, by the collection of student data. So Gates talks about real-time assessments for gauging student learning. Dell talks about formative data gathered as learning in happening in the moment use of data in the classroom. So we've got this like focus on data. And that the personalized learning products are going to be evidence-based interventions here. So Dell says, you know, proven approach to instilling problem solving. Gates talks about it as continuous improvement grounded in data and evidence. Chan Zuckerberg, cutting edge research, again, grounded in data. But there's a sidestep that goes on. Rather than relying on data for evidence of the value of these personalized learning innovations, instead, they discuss the importance of gathering data as evidence for their innovation, so that the data is being gathered so that they can improve their products. There's really no evidence that is given that the products themselves work. The data is important to keep improving the products. So here, this is, you know, Gates talking about advancing research in support and development in support of new innovations, investing in building the evidence for social and emotional learning, expanding the evidence base, learning what it takes to turn schools into places that empower and equip students, studying these efforts to share what is learned. So that's Hewlett. And Chan Zuckerberg and Gates is the last quote here. We also see an interesting narrative about teachers. Teachers lack the resources and knowledge to be more effective. So Dell, you know, teachers are expected to do certain things, but they don't have the autonomy, the tools, or the skills in their classrooms to do so. But we're holding out the promise of that with these innovations. Hewlett, teachers lack the agency and resources they need to reach all their students, and schools are restricted in what, how, and when they can improve. The foundations see themselves and position themselves as partners in all of this. That partners, collaborators, working with parents and teachers, those are sort of the refrains that we see over and over again. Empower teachers, to support each student according to their unique learning needs. That's Chan Zuckerberg, that quote. Gates, ensuring that teachers and leaders have what they need to be successful. Dell, talented teachers with the right resources, information, control of their classroom, and the most useful and relevant instruction to help them. Finally, the only mention of privacy, it was by Dell, and it was the last mention. Even though all of them are talking about gathering all this data and the usefulness of data, Dell is the only one that mentioned privacy and did it as the last phrase on there. We went through the first 2 levels of the websites because they vary very much after that. While we believe data is a powerful tool in the classroom, we also believe it should be used in a safe and secure manner. Therefore, we work with others to improve these practices. So now I'll switch to Val, and she'll take over with the Ed Week articles and the conclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Pris. So as Pris indicated, we're looking at the Ed Week articles because we're really curious to see if and how these discourses that are embedded within the Foundation's approach to education technology as a whole and personalized learning in particular trickle down into conversations with teachers, conversations with policymakers. And EdWeek is particularly interesting because it does target both teachers and the ed tech industry. And as we went through our discourse analysis of that data set, it really divided, it completely bifurcated. There was a dominant discourse that was made up of 14 articles that were written by 8 authors. And you can see from the slide that these are largely journalists that are focused on the commercial aspects of education technology. They're there to gather information and talk to ed tech companies. And it does dominate the discussion within the newspaper as a whole. But at the same time, there was a parallel alternative discourse that was almost exclusively written by one author, or journalist, Benjamin Herold. And you can see that he comes from public radio. And there were 2 small fragments that I'll also be drawing on as well. One from a university researcher who has looked into the question of whether or not personalized learning works. And the other was a comment about privacy by an ed tech representative. So that dominant discourse largely replicates the Foundation narratives around personalized learning and starts with the assumption that, you know, education's just broken. And this really came out strongly in one article called Student-Centered Learning Top of Mind for Companies. You can see that the EdTech representative at the top of the bullets, you know, kind of takes the same position. You know, old assumptions about what schools really need are going to be called into question. That old system was for the industrialized world. It just doesn't work anymore. But I think it's significant that this same trope that education is broken is also picked up by a school principal who says we have a lot of unlearning to do because, you know, if we just do what we've always done, well, that's just wrong. We know that's wrong. It's broken. And also by a member of a school board, so an administrator and a policymaker. You know, why would we put our efforts into a 20th century model? Because we know that that just doesn't work. So within that starting point that the education system is broken, personalized learning is then positioned as the natural solution. It's powered by, it will lead to, it's technology driven, it will lead to this sea change in learning. It will fix what's broken and take us to nirvana. And it's powered by algorithms. And they're described as these never-ending feedback loops. And it's not only a natural solution, it's also presented as an inevitable one. It's just part of the story of innovation through technology. It's going to be baked into the DNA of how teachers work. Now, what is much less clearly defined, as in the Foundation discourse, is what the heck personalized learning is. There are these aspirational definitions that are offered that really focus on what they hope to get out of it. We're going to be able to help students meet their distinctive academic needs. We'll be able to tailor instruction. We'll be able to customize learning. But again, there's almost no discussion of the data practices that will enable personalized learning to meet these aspirational goals. So in all of those articles, in fact, there's only 3 mentions of data. And I think they're actually really quite illuminating. The teacher's perspective that's offered is, yes, this stuff creates a lot of data, but I need that data because it will help me make instructional decisions. So no critical analysis of how this plays out in the classroom, what it does to my social relationships with students, how it replaces me. I just need the data. The policymaker quote actually is coming from Vermont, which in 2013 actually passed legislation to I want to say force, that's the wrong word, that's it, require, thank you, my politics came out, to require all schools in Vermont to move to a personalized learning model. So that was in 2013. This quote is from 2016, where the policymaker, after talking about the legislation and all their implementations, sort of goes, yeah, that includes data too, so you know there'll be assessments and dashboards. We're just moving into that phase now. We're just trying to figure out what to do with that data now, 3 years after they had initiated the shift. So it's a discourse that the EdTech representative repeats, but it's also a discourse that's adopted by the teacher and the policymaker. So this aspirational approach also skips over any details around administration or practice and focuses primarily on the need to remove barriers. So there's the things you would expect. Schools don't spend enough money on EdTech. Schools are really inconsistent in how they implement. Schools have a lack of vision because they're not getting on board fast enough. But interestingly enough, the biggest barrier in this discourse are teachers. Teachers are a problem. So they talk about teachers in 2 different ways. Teachers that adopt personalized learning are celebrated as individuals. You know, Sally Jones in this school did this amazing thing. Woohoo, she's got vision. Whereas teachers as a whole are described as overwhelmed, underskilled, and out of date. Again, replicating the foundation discourse. And interestingly enough, they set up this dynamic between believers and skeptics. The problem is that teachers just don't believe in the technology. It's their beliefs about technology that are hindering its effective use. Their beliefs are holding teachers back in terms of using technology in meaningful ways. So believers are celebrated because they get it. They're with the program. They're being creative. Whereas teachers that are not using these technologies are considered to be skeptics. Now, the way that teachers can improve upon this problem is to partner with EdTech. And so when the technology team gets right into the room with them and starts telling them how they can teach, well, then we're going to have a collaborative approach. And that's going to allow us to modernize. So teachers, again, are the barrier. And they're a barrier not only because they have these terrible beliefs, but because they don't have any expertise. They don't know it all. They're not the experts. They don't really understand how technology works. Whereas the technocrats that design the algorithm have that knowledge because they're collecting data. And if they don't have it now, they'll have it tomorrow. They just need more data. So if we can just get that data stream going, we'll be able to solve the problem. Now, there's an indication that the system is broken, teachers are unskilled, and personal learning is going to fix it. And we understand that that will completely disrupt the education process. But that's okay. That's what innovation does. Change is hard, but, you know, we have to do that. So interestingly enough, the discussions of students also focus on the celebrating of individual students who produce technology-related products. Willem, for example, is described right to the color of his eyes and his long curly brown hair because he turned a Fisher-Price car into a working wheelchair and is planning on going to MIT when he finishes high school. So we celebrate these individual technology users, but the general underlying assumption is that he's an exception. Students they do not have the expertise to drive their own learning. So we need personalized learning algorithms because that's what will allow all students to thrive like Willem. And again, this is going to run off of the use of data that is better than teachers. So we will be able to understand this because those overworked teachers can't figure it out. So as long as we get the data, we can even take their intuitions and write that into our algorithm as well. So the social relationships that are at the heart of the classroom are kind of overwritten. So when you look at personalized learning then, you kind of again have a very strange bifurcation. You know, on the one hand, the aspiration of the technology is to put every student in the driver's seat so they can drive their own learning. But in actual fact, when you play with the discourse, you see that there's an assumption that they can't do that, that it's the algorithm that will be making the decisions on the basis of the data that are in the best interest of the student. The unanswered question is always whether or not this personalized learning works. But again, believers believe in it. Skeptics' main tool of skepticism is to say, hey, wait a minute, what about the evidence? And that's represented in these discourses as actually as a strategy to stifle innovation and a selfish desire to kind of keep the status quo because teachers really aren't very good at what they do. Interestingly enough, and I know I'm whipping through this, there's a lot of data here, the dominant discourse does inject foundations into it expressly. Foundations are certainly inserted into the discourse in a number of ways. There are 15 different foundations that are mentioned in this set of articles, but only 12 are mentioned only once, and in the more traditional way of they gave us money and we did something with it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation are treated very, very differently. There are 13 and 10 mentions of the, or articles actually, not mentions. There's 13 and 10 articles that focus on this highly personalized story about these pioneers with vision and great fortunes. Like just, they talk about completely unreasonable numbers and that they're willing to bring their billions of dollars to help us fix the broken problem of education. How am I doing? I can do it. The alternative discourse, as I said, kind of is in parallel. The dominant discourse ignores it completely, but it's quite aware of the fact that it is fighting this broader understanding. And interestingly enough, it's by bringing teachers into the mix. They say, look, this is about learning. Teachers know what they're doing. Teachers have curricular goals and skills to meet them. That's what we need to focus on. But they expressly note that this is, if you look at the bottom bullet, this conversation about curriculum and teachers, it's a voice that isn't loud enough right now to make a difference. You know, we keep trying to bring it back to teachers. We've been talking about this for a while, but this conversation just doesn't have critical mass yet. Interestingly enough, they recognize these aspirational definitions of personalized learning are bereft of content. So to inject some content into them, they examine the practices in the classroom. And they go through the day to deconstruct the way this impacts the kids and the teachers. They do that by directly troubling the skeptic and believer discourse in a way that reinserts the teacher as an expert. Have you noticed I'm out of time yet? And interestingly enough, this reorients the goal of education back to raising citizens. Now, the takeaway that I need to get to for our purposes is that, interestingly enough, privacy is a key point of resistance. Privacy is mobilized as a way to say these data practices raise an incredible number of questions that directly impact children's experiences as rights holders and as learners. Very much what you were saying, Jen. And interestingly enough as well, it's the one place where they reintroduce notions of parents, that parents have valuable and interesting input into this. So I think that it really raises interesting questions for us as a privacy community about the very importance of privacy, both as a data protection model, but also as a way of articulating these boundary violations that are shifting our experiences as human beings in a technological society. So I'll leave it there.
Applause. So thank you for this very insightful presentation describing the situation in the US, describing the work of the foundations, and we all can expect to know that it will have a global impact as well, and it will not be relevant for the US or Canada as such. We clearly move, like from the times when at school we were discussing how we should learn about technology, and now we move to the point we are learning through technology. And it's clearly a shift in that, and it comes with a lot of questions, with privacy and data protection at the very heart of it, but also there are more fundamental questions about what kind of education we want and what is learning about. So there are many more things that I would like to say and question the speakers, but I will allow to do that for the general audience after the last presentation. Stacey will reflect on what has been said and will she, so yeah, go ahead, Stacey.
Thank you so much. I'll keep it relatively short because I know we'd like to get to questions from the audience, but thank you, Joe and Lina, for having us here. For those who aren't familiar, Future of Privacy Forum is a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C., so I'm coming here from the United States. We work with advocates, we work with scholars and the industry community to inform policy debates, and a good chunk of that is around education privacy. So I'll just say a couple things, maybe reflecting on United States law and around this. And the first is that the generally accepted wisdom, I think, is that the United States does not have a privacy law. Certainly we do not have a federal privacy law that is comprehensive and baseline like the GDPR. What many don't know about student privacy in particular, though, is that in the United States we actually have a very robust local framework or a variety of student privacy laws at the local level. Education is considered to be a core local, primarily local issue in the United States, even at a constitutional level. So from 2013 to 2019, over 130 state laws were passed governing student privacy in 39 states. They're all very different from each other. Some of these student privacy laws govern education tech vendors. Some, if not many or most, govern educational institutions, school districts, school boards, educational agencies, and what kind of data they can collect and whether or not they may share it. And others are focused primarily on law enforcement access to student data. And then at the federal level, of course, there's a significant amount of federal funding for public institutions, public educational institutions, and as part of that, there is a 1970s passed federal education privacy law that governs what the educational institutions may collect and what they may share under what constraints. So within that framework, I'll just say education is obviously a unique space for which traditional consumer privacy laws don't necessarily align very well, by which I mean they may sometimes conflict and they may sometimes not go far enough for a couple of reasons. One, in that education is a unique space. The two best reasons for that are, one, I think that there are major safety concerns at issue in the school space. We're dealing with vulnerable populations. You may be aware, particularly in the United States, in the last few years, there have been increasing concerns around student safety that are putting more fire in the discourse, I guess, around keeping students safe and leading a lot of schools to become more interested in the use of things like biometric technologies and facial recognition to keep students safe, right? And that can be a difficult and emotional thing to debate. And the second is that schools, particularly higher education institutions, have often additional incentives to consider beyond improving educational outcomes. They may be underfunded, they may be concerned about their ranking, their standing in comparison to other educational institutions, and this may sometimes even play a bigger role, be a stronger source of motivation than improving the educational outcomes. So compare, for example, a local college that I'll leave unnamed for now, but became quite famous in the last few years, that had a president who was hired from the business community and immediately instituted a set of very detailed surveys for the incoming freshman class. These surveys collected information on anything from mental health to would you describe yourself as team player to self-indicating reflections of ability and so on. And then, you know, with very little involvement from others and certainly no notice to students or parents, approached the students who were seen as unlikely to succeed and encouraged or incentivized them to drop out as the deadline was approaching for submission of records that would determine school ranking. Things like, we'll give you your tuition money back if you go somewhere else, right? This was discovered, it became a major problem. The president was fired. It was a major problem. But compare this with something like the Chicago public school system, which has collected similar information on its high school freshmen, what kinds of classes they're taking, and information of that sort, and used it to identify students who were likely to be struggling and target them for additional support and additional attention to help them succeed, right? So the incentives matter, I think, a great deal in this discussion. And ways in which privacy laws don't always line up, I'll just mention particularly in the United States. Many, if not most, of our privacy laws are at heart consumer protection laws, right? So when you think about the Federal Trade Commission and many of the laws that are passed at the state level and being passed at the state level and being drafted and discussed currently in Congress, they frequently approach privacy from the standpoint of consumer protection. And that means that primarily they're focused on identifying and mitigating harm. And the harm is often defined as economic harm or injury, often measurable harm of some kind, right? Because the primary focus is consumer protection. Now, this is an important aspect, I think, of privacy laws, but in many ways, particularly in this context, it simply doesn't go far enough. So these kinds of harms don't include many of the aspects that are increasingly of concern in the education space, like algorithmic harm, fairness, equity, students struggling, giving students room to grow and develop as human beings, right, free from the effects of surveillance or even perceived surveillance. Ways in which privacy laws might conflict, just a couple. Collection-based limits can be challenging. One particularly notorious law passed in the United States was in Louisiana back 5+ years ago. Louisiana passed the strictest United States state privacy law that I know of in the country. It created very harsh enforcement penalties, including jail time and massive fines and penalties for the collection of personal information defined very broadly, with the result, at least at the state level anecdotally, that some students stopped, some teachers were so afraid of violating this new unknown law that they stopped doing things like broadcasting team sports scores or publishing yearbooks and things of that nature. Now, of course, it was quickly amended because we can't live under a system like that, but very strict collection-based limits can be really challenging in this space. And things like data deletion can be tricky in the education context, for example. The Children's Online Privacy Act, which governs information from students 13 and under in the United States, has deletion rights for parents. Parents may come to a school and request to exercise their deletion rights in ways that conflict with the goals of the teacher. I want to delete my student's homework. I want to delete my student's record for the year. Well, that would, in some instances, conflict with the goals and the valid goals of the teacher. That said, we know that data deletion is a crucial aspect of this, right? So it's a crucial aspect of processing data from children generally, not just students, because children need to have the room to play, to make mistakes. I think it was Jen, I think, was saying, it was Lina, was saying, you know, what are students going to do if they're not surveilled? They're going to get up to no good, right? Well, of course they are. That's the point. This is part of growing up and learning and developing as a human being. Just making a prediction looking out across this room, I would guess that when most of you, if or when you went to college, if you went sufficiently far away in distance from home, you had the opportunity to reinvent yourself, to leave your past behind. This is something that we all experience if you're older than a certain age, and the fear is that students today, or children today, will not be able to escape the permanent records of their past, good or bad. So, and Julie Cohen, I should note, the brilliant Georgetown law professor, has done a lot of great work around that in the area of privacy and its effect on human development. So we typically call for more training, more informed public policy debates. Like Jen said, you can't be thoughtful about something and if you don't see it or you don't know what it is, right? In this vein, I think parents, I agree with Valerie, parents can be a very helpful guide. In 2016, FPF did a survey of United States parents that was illuminating. The result, as you might expect, is that parents are largely quite familiar with and very supportive of the use of technology in classrooms when it's used to improve educational outcomes, but they are often not aware of their legal rights and not aware of how data might be collected and used onward for other purposes. So 68%, for example, stated that they were very concerned about the possibility of a permanent record being kept on a child that might affect them in later decisions, career paths in college and so on. So I'll stop there, except just to say FPF does a tremendous amount of informational work on this topic that you can find on our website, and all of that is led by our director of an awesome education privacy team in Washington, D.C., led by my colleague Amelia Vance. So for more on that, I would check it out at our website.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thanks.
That was very insightful as well. A round of applause. And I would like to open the floor for everyone who wants to make a contribution or pose a question to this brilliant panel. So please go ahead, and the microphone is walking somewhere around. Yes.
Thank you very much. Sophie Kwasny from the Council of Europe. It was a fantastic panel. I want to come back to the opening by Jen about the fact that I think there's a total lack of awareness of the problem. Only to underline that we've attributed the first Stefano Rodota Award this year, and it's been attributed to Eva Livens and Ingrid Amikaite about rights of children, and trying to respond to the challenges, which are pretty obvious. I think I will try to get the Committee of Convention 108 working on the issue and making the link with our artificial intelligence guidelines and big data guidelines, but then asking you, experts in the field, to work with us on that. So thanks a lot very much for that. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And there is a question in the first row here. Maybe we'll try now to take 3 questions, and then we'll try to answer them by the panelists. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for wonderful presentations, very insightful. My name is Simone van der Hof from Leiden University. I have first a question to Jen. What you've been describing, and you implied also, well, this is not actually within the GDPR, or some of these practices might not be. So I was wondering, are any of these practices already being challenged under the GDPR in the UK? And a question to Priscilla and Valerie. I know this wasn't within your research, but you might know anyway. Is there any research on the effectiveness of personalized education? I would be very interested also from the perspective of the GDPR, where we have the principle of proportionality. So effectiveness would actually be an important factor to take into account when it comes to seeing whether any of this personalized education is actually lawful within that principle. So looking forward to your answers.
All right. We keep the record of all the questions.
Thanks to all the panelists. I'm Alan Rubel from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I was hoping that each of you, or any of you, could speak to the role of higher education institutions in this process. So many of us are professors or students in HEIs, and we're all in on data and students and personalized education. Moreover, education departments are sort of leading in wanting to collect data for their own research purposes, and in the process of forcing or getting education systems to have specifically defined learning objectives and lots of data to support advancing those objectives. So while it's great to turn your eye to philanthropists and education systems, I mean, I wonder if we should be looking a little more at ourselves, at what those of us in higher education should look at ourselves and our role in this process. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? All right, a forest of hands here. We'll take 2 more questions, okay?
Thank you very much for the panel. I was wondering, typically in Europe, who is DPO for the school? Is it one DPO for all school, one DPO national? And have you tried working with them? And do you know what their views are on technology and education? Thank you.
Could you clarify your question?
Yeah, I wanted to know the role of the data protection officers in school.
Okay.
And if you've tried working with them, and if they're usually receptive to this kind of advocacy. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hello. You talk a lot about privacy data protection. I was thinking if you put some thoughts on the relations between privacy, data protection rights, and links between right to education. When I'm reading the general comment from UN on right to education, we are talking about availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability of this right. And this is going to the broader context of education, not only focus on privacy. Have you put some thoughts on that?
All right, thank you. So I hope all the panelists took notes of the questions. If not, I will try to remind them. And we can maybe start. Maybe first of all, Joe could say a few words on higher education. I think you are really in a position to talk about that.
Sorry. Yes. Perhaps we should highlight indeed that issue, because when looking at universities, one thing that strikes me is how systems of communication between teachers and between teachers, professors and students are also becoming bought up by the Alphabet, Google Spaces, by Microsoft, because it's much more cheaper to have a mail server for free than to organize or manage one oneself. And the same with learning platforms. We, as a university ourselves, we just switched from an open source, I would say, privacy-friendly system to a kind of a startup in the States, where we had, luckily we put our data in Europe, but it was very late in the process that we decided that, I gathered. But anyway, so we indeed, I think one of the issues being discussed here is also certainly an issue which you should be very careful about when looking at higher education in universities.
Now maybe we could turn to Jen, and maybe you could reflect on the GDPR influence as well as the data protection officer's role as, at school.
So to answer the question on challenges under GDPR, yes, Privacy International has already undertaken challenges on data brokers in general, and we are looking at challenging very shortly with the Information Commissioner's Office on the use of data brokerage in education, particularly on our own staff data, which is collected and widely distributed. We also have a national challenge against the UK government at the moment on the labelling of children in alternative provision, so the children that have been removed from mainstream education and put into other alternative education, and those reasons for that, including things like pregnancy, mental health, or young offender. And last year, government passed a law, last year, to carry out that national collection without any guidance to the local authorities of how to tell the children and parents those very sensitive labels have been put on them. So we're currently challenging that. Anyone that wants to help us fund that would be very welcome, because legal costs are expensive. The rights of the child to freedom to develop under the UN Rights of the Child absolutely underpins all of this. And the right to education underpins another challenge we had last year of the UK government, because they started collecting nationality data on every child and were telling people that it was for the benefits of understanding the immigration and the immigration system in the UK education system. And of course, we had found out at exactly the same time that it was being used for immigration enforcement. So that's another challenge we undertook, and certainly consider all of these rights to be absolutely important under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're about to lose the protections of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, Our applied GDPR is weaker than the rest of how it should be. We have deep concerns how the future looks like for the UK under data protection as we leave. And schools do not have teacher training in data protection as part of minimum teacher training. And I think all of the speakers today have evidenced why there is such a high collection of data today in schools. It's a necessary part of being a teacher, whether we like it or not, to have a good understanding of data. And also to recognize that data protection training as DPOs, whether it's a shared service or whether it's an individual in a school, is not the same necessary as understanding privacy law, and that the two need to work hand in hand, and further be based upon the fundamental rights of the child, and those which are not necessarily all underpinned by data protection law, but certainly enable it, like freedom of expression, like freedom to have an opinion, like freedom to develop fully as a child and as a human being, and to be free of discrimination in future.
Thank you, Jen. Now maybe let's move to Priscilla and Valerie and their opinion on the effectiveness of personal learning, if you have encountered any evidence of that.
Part of the difficulty with collecting evidence on the effectiveness of personalized learning is that personalized learning is not very well defined. And it means many, many different things. So at this point, there appears not to be any kind of, sort of systematic collection of data in this area that is specific to different kinds of personalized learning. There are a lot of studies that have pointed this out and have pointed to the need to have more evidence that as to its effects, whether you're talking about personalized learning that involves algorithms that may be a hybrid kind of blended learning, or that is just personalized learning where there's no machine learning involved, or possibly even no sort of data collection in the way that we're talking about it here, but more kind of an individualized education plan that has been around for a long time, specific to certain kids. So we don't see that. The other thing I wanted to touch on is sort of the role of education departments in higher education institutions, because I think that that's an important point here. And we have not really looked at that because our grant is sort of focused on the K through 12 level, but obviously what's going on in education departments is affecting the K through 12 level. The thrust of the curriculum in education departments is more on that getting teachers familiar with technology and learning about technology than it seems to be with the effects of the technology. They're starting to creep in. Okay, we've got to look at the larger social implications. Some of that has to do kind of less with privacy from what I've been gathering, and more with the question of if the kids are sitting in front of a computer all day, or they're interacting with a computer, are they developing the kind of social, emotional learning and the skills in terms of, playing well with others that we want them to learn in kindergarten? Are they developing those skills? So I think I'll leave that there. And then the only other thing I would say, and it sort of parallels what Jen said, there doesn't have to be a trade-off between the right to education and the right against discrimination, or the right to privacy, and we shouldn't start to juxtapose those two things.
I'll just add to that briefly. There are studies out there that have shown there's no causal relationship between personalized learning and better educational outcomes. So actually, there's evidence it doesn't work. There's one study that was put out by RAND that said, doesn't look like it works, but maybe it works a little. But it's also important to realize that in the ecosystem of ed tech, that study was paid for by the foundations themselves, as is some of the advocacy work that's done by your organization, for example. So this is a very incestuous environment, and research is used in surprising ways. So I think it's really important to be very critical about the outcomes that are there, because the social science stuff says, not working so much. I did want to mention that we've been working with in Canada, education as a provincial jurisdiction. So we've been working with a number of our provincial privacy commissioners, and we put on 2 one-day workshops with privacy officers that work in our ministries of education, the privacy commissioners themselves, and teachers. And one of the needs that was identified by teachers and school administrators is that when they're negotiating with these big companies, they're getting blown out of the water because there's no equality of bargaining power. And so we strategized with the privacy commissioners how they could intervene with these companies and the ministries of education to push back. So the administrators were looking out for ways to protect data and keep it out of this stream, and still, get some benefits of using technology for educational purposes. So I thought that was a useful approach. The last thing I would say is that when you're looking at the conventions on the rights of the child, I think it's absolutely the right way to anchor our work. But I think it's important as well, in addition to all of the rights that Jen mentioned, to look at media rights that are guaranteed to children under the convention. They're given the right to benefit from their culture, to have access to media, and media that reflects their need as human individuals to have to experience their own cultural capital. And I think that's particularly powerful when you look at the way technologies have been embedded in education. Lastly, I just want to add to the skepticism about how great data is for higher education. In my university, the University of Ottawa, that usually means they want to, we'll get data from a course, we'll see what works, we'll do it online, and we'll pay the person who develops the class once, and then we'll just pummel it out. We won't have to pay professors anymore. It'll be great. That will be learning. And this really came home to me, that universities don't always use the data in ways that you would expect. So one of the first uses of this data from students at my university was to retain them as consumers, so we get their tuition every year. And we were told as professors that in first and second year, when we started a class, we should have a coffee at each station where they're going to sit and music playing in the background. Improving their consumer experience, but not necessarily their learning.
I just wanted to add one thing on the sort of teachers or administrators negotiating with the ed tech companies. One of the things that the Department of Education has emphasized in the United States and has on its website as a sort of guidance for schools and teachers is the terms of service or the contracts with the ed tech companies, and what kinds of things to look for in those contracts and how to negotiate those contracts, because it's really at that stage of contracting with the companies that it's key. And I think more of the schools are picking up on that and the importance of that, and not having just sort of teachers using sort of off-the-shelf, the shrink-wrap-free software that they get.
Thank you for answering these questions. I know that we went well into the lunch break, but it's not our fault. It's the setup of a conference. So I will give an opportunity for all the speakers to put forward an issue that needs to be addressed most urgently in the context of personalized learning.
I'll just say the final word on a crucial issue goes straight to the point that the gentleman in the back raised about taking seriously the right to education, which means taking seriously the right to education for all, including students with learning disabilities on individualized education plans or with physical disabilities. We just published a report on the Internet of Things and persons with disabilities this week. And I think there's tremendous promise here, and the temptation is to go all in with the technology, right? I had an advocate from the Association from the Blind and Visually Impaired say to me, "What, am I not going to use voice technologies to control my smart home? Of course I'm going to use it. It's a game changer. I don't care what kind of data it collects." And so the temptation is to go all in, and you have to do it in a way that avoids stigma, avoids discrimination, and takes the concerns of that community seriously. And so in our report, our biggest recommendation is that policymakers can't know what they don't know, and so people from these communities have to be at the table.
Thanks.
One thing we didn't get a chance to discuss is the way that these personalized learning algorithms are created on the assumption that content doesn't matter anymore. So it's not about, there's an assumption that you can't possibly know what kids are going to need in the future. Content is irrelevant, it's all about process. And I think when you're talking about a kid in grade 3 and teaching them how to read or get math literacy, I think that's just a really important flaw in the thinking.
So the one thing that we haven't talked about that concerns me as I look at the sort of personalized learning and the algorithms is that the way the data is analyzed, it seems to make, and this is, you know, sort of black box stuff, we really don't know what the algorithms are doing. But there's certain assumptions that seem to be made about, you know, how long a student stays on a particular page and what that means, or how many wrong answers they get and what that means. And it's looking at the data in isolation from the sort of social situation in which the student may be, whether it's at school or at home or in some cases on a school bus where they're picking up this information. There's all sorts of distractions around that student. And it seems the data seems so sterile to me from the actual experience of the student. And I kind of worry about that just in terms of how the algorithms are being built. And it's something that hasn't really been discussed.
I'm very conscious that a lot of today has been down on corporation technology and use of data, and I think we have to maintain the balance in that vision because, as the person said at the back, we have to have an ongoing discourse. It has to be something that is had between all these players. But I think we are in a fight for social justice in the education system, and I think we're fighting a battle for equality and for fairness and for transparency and safety of these products. And it's really important that we don't see education only in terms of what we can measure, because at the moment we're increasingly going to a world that places value only on what we can measure and not value on children as children. And it's increasingly important in a world of technology, in artificial intelligence, that we put human rights at the center of everything we do.
Okay, thank you again, and this leaves me to thank all the speakers and the moderator for this really inspiring and enlightening session, and to thank CPDP for organizing this session. Thank you all.